Look, all that's important is her suitability today to be released and whether or not she'd be a threat to the community. Well, as a matter of fact, it may be that a considerable amount of what she did in the past plays a role in evaluating her suitability today. Now, Laura, in a way, for her to say that only factors today are to be considered, that's not really the law, is it?
No, because one of the things the board has to take into account is her behavioral history. And what she did in the past, her behavior is obviously very relevant to that. It also, the board has to consider her past and present attitudes about the crime. Her past attitudes about the crime are, or you just look at the crime itself. I mean, that's how you know what her attitude is. So to a certain extent, the crime itself is relevant, even 30 years later.
Well, nobody will ever dispute, and I don't believe her attorney, who I think is doing an excellent job and has been very eloquent, is suggesting for a moment that the parole board should not consider what happened here, the crime. That has been gone over so many times. That's a given. But what we have here some 30 years later is a woman who, under the law, is now eligible for parole. And for a government agency to say we're not, and we're really never going to release you on parole, flies in the face of the law with the entitlement, and the entitlement is that as long as you are the model prisoner, and that means a model citizen, that's really who she has become. She is entitled now to be released. Listen, if we're going to have a system where if you commit a horrific murder, you will never be released on parole, then you know what? Say it. Say it up front. Say it in the law. The parole board should stop the sham proceedings and say the crime was so horrible we're never going to release you. Because quite frankly, Fred, there's nothing more for this woman or any person like her ever to do that would ever allow her to be released if there was in fact a horrible, horrific crime such as this.
But that's not what the parole board's saying at all. In fact, the parole board's saying, come back in 2 years. We're going to look at this again. They're not saying you're never getting out. And she's sentenced to life in jail. She's not sentenced to you're entitled to parole. She's sentenced to life in jail.
Okay, now, by the way, on this last point about just say that there's no parole, coincidentally, the District of Columbia last week, a law went into effect which abolishes parole. It was passed by Congress for the District of Columbia. So in some jurisdictions, that's where we're coming to. Leslie Van Houten, of course, was convicted of the brutal slayings of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. She stabbed Rosemary some 16 times. Now, since the 1969 killings, Van Houten has renounced her association with Charles Manson, and she declares that she's reformed. Now, as part of our Streetwise series, we did ask some people on the street if they believe it's possible to reform.